Jonathan, what's going on? Everybody out there, welcome back to the MicroCast. Super excited to welcome Jonathan Levitt to the show. For those of you who aren't familiar with Jonathan, Jonathan is the creator and host of For the Long Run podcast. And he's conducted over 300 podcast interviews over 5 years. It's pretty amazing. Those interviews often span a wide spectrum of perspectives, backgrounds, and ability levels. Athletes in the running space, they seem to always get to the heart of what we really care about at Microcosm, which is what's going on the inside. The motivations, why do athletes pursue goals year after year? What keeps them going? These are the important questions that we love to get into. And I brought Jonathan onto the podcast this week to chat about those things, because who else better to talk about the inner workings of athletes than a guy who's interviewed over 300 athletes? Pretty incredible. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, TJ. And thank you for making up 2 of those episodes on the podcast. TJ, you've been a great guest. We did one episode wholly about you, and then we did one episode that was basically like a breakdown of my of a breakthrough race I had in September that you and Zoe were at, which was awesome. Well, you ask, who better to chat through some of this stuff than a guy who has talked through this with 300 athletes? Yesterday, I applied to be a part of DEXA AI, which is the platform that basically internalizes podcasts so that you can use it as like a chat GPT and ask it questions that after having been trained on all of your content. So who better than me? That. Stay tuned.
I'm not sure I'm ready mentally and emotionally to turn over these exciting conversations to a computer.
Well, for now, the computers haven't taken our jobs, so here we are, excited to chat.
Yeah, stoked, man. I would be surprised if there's a listener out there who isn't familiar with your podcast and who you are. You've become really a thought leader in the running space, which I think is why so many people know who you are, whether it's coming from the inside tracker side of things, advocating for athletes to have this more holistic experience with their health and wellness, through running, or if it's through, the interviews you do in your podcast, or just your training and the fact that you've been a lifelong runner for so long. But, maybe for those who don't know you, how did you get into the podcasting space? What has driven kind of your particular interest in understanding the why behind why these athletes on all levels, we're really talking about athletes on all levels here. What makes them tick? Like where is your interest in all of this, and how did that begin for you?
Yeah, so I appreciate that intro, and honestly, I have a little imposter syndrome sometimes because so I just got back from Orlando with the Olympic trials in the marathon, and which might be a short run for a lot of people listening to this. And I was there with a lot of like big creators and people who have really big audiences, and the Alley on the Runs that have huge podcasts. And I was chatting with my friend Aaron Bailey, who was basically like, you've just been doing it for a long time, and you've been doing it in a way that is like, you love it, and you're not doing it for anyone else. And as a result, the numbers aren't as big, and the following, I'm not getting stopped on the street like Ali Feller is, which is fine. It might get annoying after a while, but it's fun. It's fun to observe. But there's still a little aspect of that imposter syndrome. So when I hear something like the way you just presented it, it's a nice reaffirming of like why I'm doing it. And it's not for the influence of like, oh, there are a lot of people that know who you are, and more about like you're guiding. I'm helping guide people in discussions and in conversations that are meaningful and important. And if one person is impacted, or 10 people are impacted, or 100,000 people are impacted, to me, it's like I'm learning from it, and there are other people that are learning from it, and that's what matters. So back to your question, my role at Inside Tracker for a while was basically like spend time with athletes at races. So for those who aren't familiar, Inside Tracker is all about helping people live healthier longer. So how do you know what your body needs? Use a blood test. How do you know what to do with that information? That's where we can help. And so we either facilitate a comprehensive blood test or import existing data from a physician. And so in our early years, it was like pretty focused on endurance athletes, and there were most professional trail runners were using Inside Tracker, and most still do. So I was living in Boston at the time, and I was spending a lot of time in Boulder, in San Francisco, and Flagstaff, and at races in Tahoe, just like meeting awesome people and learning from them and asking them questions. And so I think back to May of 2018. I'm in Boulder for like a week, 8-day period. I go to Colorado Springs, and I met up with Zach Miller, and we started the Manitou Incline together. He did it about twice, and I did it once, and then we ran down on the Bar Trail, which is stunning. And then we got dinner, and Zach was running, notoriously running 150 miles a week at the time. And a couple of years prior, I was in the race where he and Hayden were racing at North Face 50, I believe, in 2016. And I was finishing a 10K, and they were finishing a 50 miler. And they blew my doors off, running their 49th and 50th mile as I was running my 6th mile. And I was like, what the hell is happening? What is this noise coming out of this guy? I didn't really know who Zach was at the time, but fast forward a few years, and I sure did, and I found myself on a run with him. And so as we were eating dinner and he was putting on this clinic of eating, I was like, why do you do this? What are you doing? Like, you're choosing to suffer so hard. And I told him of when I saw him and Hayden finishing that race. And I was like, that was one of the most impressive things I'd ever seen, especially knowing you'd been running for 5 hours. And so he put his fork down and talked for like 10 minutes. Then he picked it up and finished my dinner. It's like almost not a joke. Anybody who knows Zach knows that that's not a joke. So I was like, this is interesting. I'm on to something. So I was spending all this time with people and learning a lot from them. And at one point I was like, why don't I just put a microphone in front of these conversations and see if people are interested? And so I did that. And pretty quickly there were 1,000 people listening to the episodes. And I was like, wow, I thought like 50 people might be interested at most. And then all of a sudden it was 2,000 and 3,000. And 300 episodes later, I have episodes with 15,000 downloads. And it's wild to me that, and 1.5 million overall. And so it's wild to me that like that many people have listened and continue to listen. And like the audience is continuing to grow. And I'm continuing to learn from it. So I'll keep doing it.
That's amazing. I love that. I like how it kind of started with your curiosity and you've evolved it in a way where you've really taken into account, okay, like what am I interested in, and designing kind of a podcast around that. And then it feels very authentic in that sense. It's a lot less of like a fan service, which is, something that I've been thinking a lot about, because, we have a number of athletes we coach and people follow this podcast and my newsletter and, the general things that Microcosm does, and how do we continue to, lean into what we feel is authentic without also like developing curated content that like fits a specific like demographic of people. Cause then, I think that's inherently flawed when you're a coach, right? Like you don't want to serve up like a specific like viewpoint. You want to be able to access multiple viewpoints and able to address the broad needs of people. And I've always felt like your podcast, for me anyways, has been interesting because like you don't have just like one perspective that's like pushed through over 300 episodes. You have this confluence of different perspectives that ultimately I think we can draw like really cool conclusions from, but at the same time really respects like the individuality that is athletics. You know, everybody has their individual way of relating. Something that I feel like you and I have really in common is that like our belief that running is a vehicle. And, you know, what is it a vehicle for? You know, a vehicle for self-expression, the deeper sides of yourself. And I think that's like one of the coolest things that I've gotten as being kind of a fan of your podcast and somebody who, you know, continually listens to different episodes is that we get to understand what the vehicle is for each individual person. And it kind of comes in without some other kind of influence or motive behind it, which is, you know, one of the reasons why I brought you on here, because I wanted to kind of dive deep and pick your brain as to like, what have you learned from interviewing all these folks, you know, from the front of the pack to the back of the pack, everywhere in between. So maybe like just to get into a little of that,
Yeah, I mean, I can answer
what do you
that.
feel like?
Go
Yeah.
So,
Well, I was going to ask, what do you think some of the common threads are between, you know, the elites, the mid pack, and the back of the pack when it comes to like the deeper why behind what they're doing or their vehicle for expression?
yeah, I think the common thread is that at some point everybody realizes that the best way to have a strong and long-term relationship with running and achieve your goals in running, whether however you define success and achieving goals, is that it's a balance of like being really focused on achieving like checking the box on a daily basis and doing the small things, and ultimately not giving a shit about like what happens in 3 months, whether that's a race or whether that's a PR or whether that's, you know, a better training cycle ahead. And it's like, are you doing the things on a day-to-day basis that can be controlled? Are you controlling the controllables? So I'm in sales, and so it's very easy for me to look at my year and understand what is required and able to like quote unquote be successful, achieve my goal. What is the number? How do I work backwards from that? Marathoning, ultra running, goal setting around a specific event is similar to like, if the goal is to sell X number of millions of dollars, or the goal is to run a 4 hour and 15-minute marathon, like you're going to break down that goal in a similar way, in that like you can't do it today, and if you can do it today, set a higher goal. But it's not the goal that is the most important part. My boss might disagree, but it's the like. But if you do the fundamentals on a daily basis in business or in running, you're likely to be able to achieve whatever it is that you've set out to do. And if you can somehow figure out how to enjoy that process, now we're in the like cliche process versus outcome piece. But like 99% of the conversations I've had are with people who would agree that they either enjoy the process more, want to enjoy the process more, or have learned that it's important to enjoy the process versus the outcome. CJ Albertson would violently disagree with this. And he did on my podcast, and he was like, man, I hate training. I just like racing. I just want to race. But that seems to be a unique experience. And that's not to say that racing inherently is not good or that it shouldn't be celebrated. It should certainly be celebrated, but it's just another box to check on a day-to-day basis. And it's like every 90 day or every 6 month kind of thing. And it's just a barometer of where you're at and what you can express on that day. And so I'm really excited to get my podcast fed into this DEXA AI algorithm and, be able to say, oh, what's the most common takeaway from 300 episodes? But like, I could tell you that too. The most common takeaway is consistency is all that matters. Having fun. Okay. Consistency is one of the most important things. It's not all that matters. Having fun is incredibly important. Having a sense of community around you who can motivate and inspire you and keep you accountable is really important. And having a coach helps tremendously. I think there are a lot of people that are. I'm going to plug Microcosm here. There are a lot of people that feel that they're not good enough to have a coach, or they're like, "Oh, I just need to break 4 hours in the marathon, then I'm good enough to get a coach," or "I just need to run my first 50K, and then I'll get a coach." And I think there's some statistic that like 90% of runners are uncoached. And when you came on my podcast, we talked about the Microcosm experience and how people engage with you as a coach and whatnot. And we have the same coach. I've worked with David for, I don't know, a billion years at this point. We're up to over 2,000 entries, 2,000 days in the log. And initially it was all about running. It was, breaking 3 hours in the marathon. And then we did. And I was like, cool, glad I checked that box. Like now what? And the now what has become how do I use running as a vehicle for everything else in life? And how do I learn from running? And how do I use running to my benefit? And that's the aspect that having a coach has really solidified. So if somebody's listening and they're like, oh, wow, I love what TJ has to say. This sounds awesome, but I'm not good enough runner, or I'm back of the pack. I'd say that those are the people that stand to gain the most because of the self-belief that can be instilled in a runner that then applies to the rest of their life. And I'll land this plane momentarily. I think that the lessons that elite runners and professional runners learn while training at the highest level enables them to be better in all aspects of life, and even more so if you're an amateur runner. And even more if you can take the lessons you're learning on the roads and trails and apply that to like how you engage with your boss or your spouse or partner or significant other or parents or siblings or friends or whatever. And if and when you can figure out how to do that, that's when running really matters.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, gosh, there's so much goodness in that. And I think, just grabbing that vehicle piece for a second, that it seems like what I was hearing from you, Jonathan, was that a commonality is that with a lot of the athletes that you've interviewed, the majority are not new to the sport, right? So they've had time to kind of have similar journeys with their relationship to sport, to running, that you've had or that I've had, where it kind of starts off very narrow and we're thinking like, okay, how do I just like capitalize on this week of training? How do I continue to reach or exceed my goals? Like I'm almost a little myopic in my view because I'm thinking solely in the athletic pursuit,
right,
and accomplishing the goals. And then, as you gain a little insight, a little time in the sport, you start to broaden out like, what is this really helping me do? Oh, it's helping to facilitate me living the kind of life I want to live. Like it is a much more holistic thing than I really realized before. And then that's when we really start to understand what is sport. When we choose a discipline, we're getting in the driver's seat of a specific vehicle that allows us to express parts of who we are.
a Cybertruck,
And
right?
yeah. And I think, that's the power of the microcosm. Like when you see like this small thing that you're doing, how it plays a role in the greater part of your life. And, something that we kind of always go back to when we're chatting is like, oh, those athletes who don't feel like they're ready to be coached, that they're not good enough, um, I would ask them to, one, examine other parts of their lives.
I would literally
Like, where do you
bet them, and I'd say like, I'll bet you 3 months of coaching that you would find this valuable, and like I'm that confident in how beneficial having a coach can be for someone who doesn't think that they are worthy enough to have a coach. Like that is the exact person who will benefit tremendously.
Totally. And I think that a lot of folks, they don't really realize like that comes from this kind of part of us, the ego driven side to us that instills self doubt, comes from not feeling like we're enough, that we're not worthy, that we need to achieve a certain thing to then get the external validation that says we deserve a coach. But ultimately, that validation is most powerful when it comes from within. And something that, I've learned a lot from listening to your interviews is the power of that kind of having a strong internal world. It's really like very obvious in the interviews that you have. Like these athletes, the majority of them have a very strong relationship with who they are, what running means to them, their why, their purpose. Like, yes, goals are important, and there's something that we can use to, it's like a carrot or a North Star, like knowing who we want to become or what we want to accomplish gives us like tangible reasoning for like our thoughts and beliefs and what they're in service of every day, those daily actions. Without that, like we have nothing for our barometer to work with, nothing for our internal compass to work with. But I think that self-limiting beliefs it's like predominant in our culture because we see, there's constantly examples of people who are achieving so much and we compare ourselves to them and we feel like, oh, we're not doing enough, or we're not at a point in the journey where we know enough about our why to hire a coach, or, whatever these things are. And my always thought is like, well, examine the rest of your life. Like, where do you really feel like you aren't thinking small? Because if you think you don't deserve a coach, you're thinking small. You're stuck in small vision syndrome. Like you're stuck in that side of you, that the more ego, judgmental, and evaluative side to your psychology. And that's there to keep you safe. What's going to happen if you flip those thoughts? I deserve a coach. Oh, okay. Let me think about it from the alternative perspective. What is there for me to possibly gain? Well, when I flip that and I get out of that state of judgment or ego, I'm not good enough for a coach, then I enter a state of curiosity or abundance. This is the exact opposite state of being in judgment. And I would, I'm always like, okay, think about things from that perspective for a minute, even if it feels foreign to you. And then ask yourself, like, what do I need to achieve the goals that I have, or to achieve the vision that I have? A lot of the people that you interview, Jonathan, have really strong visions for who they want to become, what they want to achieve. And I'm curious, what do you find is like in those interviews, what motivates people the most? If we were to try to find a trend in all of those interviews, where would that motivation be?
Oh, you're going to love this. You're going to love this answer. Because it's exactly what you believe as well. A few weeks ago, I got a letter from Gwen Jorgensen. Gwen is an Olympic gold medalist in triathlon in 2016. And since she got into triathlon, she's had 2 kids and one recently. And she aspires to win another Olympic gold medal in Paris this year. She's not made the team yet, but she has 2 races where she's attempting to do that in the coming weeks. And she wrote this letter over the holidays, and it was basically like, thank you for believing me. Let me show you my vision. My vision is XYZ. And it's all born out of curiosity. It was like, what is the best version of Gwen? And not the best version of the Gwen that won Olympic gold, who sat on top of the world briefly. It's the version of Gwen who exists in 2024, who has had 2 kids recently, or a 6-year-old and a 14-month-old, and it's the version of Gwen that exists today. And there's no reason to compare the prior version of Gwen that lived in Portland or Australia and had a different setup in life. And so her answer, or her this letter of intention, is the perfect microcosm of all of it, right? Because it's not, her goal was not to win an Olympic gold medal. That's a piece along the way to uncovering what is the best version of Gwen. And it's not even like wholly athletic related, right? She wants to be I think she's the epitome of this, and it's why I like spending time with her, because she thinks about things so intelligently, which is mainly why she's been able to win a gold medal at the highest stage. And so last year she was struggling in races, and then she stopped struggling in races. And what she realized was she was flying all around the world, and she was missing her kids. And she was like, I miss my kids. I miss my husband. Like, what if they were a part of this? And her husband, Pat, is like one of the most incredible people I've ever met. Pat jumps on a plane with their two kids and meets her in Japan or somewhere in Asia or Europe or whatever. And she starts winning races and podiuming. And so she realized that she needed to share these experiences with her family. And then she starts winning again. And so it's like, no, it wasn't training related. It wasn't the fact that she needed to do more reps or needed to do more miles which are like intuitive things to think might be how, if you're not performing well, just add more volume or just train harder. She is so intelligent that she looks at the mental side of the sport to understand what are the roadblocks that are standing in my way, that are blocking me from having a manifestation of the physical ability that I know that I have. Oh, it's entirely cognitive, or it's 75% cognitive. How do I unblock that? And she works with a sports psychologist, and in that work discovered that like she needed to be with her family. And so it's curiosity. It all comes down to curiosity, because when you come at it with the lens of curiosity, there's no limit, and there are no boundaries, and there's no end, and there's no like, oh, I must do this at this race, and I must hit this interval at the track today with a 72-second average on the 400s. Like, none of that is the most important or defining metric in the pursuit of, well, how good could I be? And so I think back to the conversations we had after the Crested Butte 55K, and I was like stuck in this lens of curiosity. And for the first 3 hours, I was like, well, at some point this is going to fall apart, because it always does. And then in that fourth hour, you could see and feel that shift in the videos I sent you. And it shifted from when is this going to end, to what if this doesn't end? And what if this is truly how I'm going to experience the rest of this day? And eventually it got harder. But that was like 5 hours into a 6-hour event, versus like, oh yeah, I blew up halfway through. And there was no blow up in that race. And that was the strongest mentally I've ever been. And it was entirely focused around, or majority focused around, curiosity. And there's some benefit to like doing something new and having no expectations is a really great way to practice curiosity, because if you don't know what to expect, it's really an open-ended book, and you get to write the story.
Yeah, isn't that such a cool, part of that? And I think one of the best antidotes for discomfort and seeing where potential lies in an uncomfortable situation is trying to consciously toggle into that what am I capable of in this moment, kind of like self-inquiry. Because when you tap into curiosity, you're tapping into those infinite parts of yourself, and you are inherently staying outside of judgment and evaluation, which destroys performance, especially in endurance events, because there's so much time to ruminate inside your own head. And, when we're talking about, professional athletes, like the story that you just mentioned, an athlete who's struggling, right, to perform at a high level, and then they view that through a lens of curiosity, and maybe there is some questioning there. What do I need to perform my best? Oh, I need to be with my family. I need to, there's this part of me that, like, when I look at the 30,000 foot view of who I am, I'm not just an athlete. I'm a human. Then I'm an athlete. Then I'm using whatever vehicle under that I've decided to do. Am I a skier? Am I a runner? Am I, am I a miler, or am I an ultra runner? Like, there's so many ways to look at that, but you always have to have that human, I think, perspective at the top of the pyramid, that you peer down through that lens, because it's not right. Like you said, like, so many athletes who are listening to this are going to be like, oh, what are the, like, training secrets that you, Jonathan, have discovered through interviewing 300 athletes over 5 years? What do these athletes do? And then it's like, oh, we'll take the story of Gwen that you just mentioned there, and it's like, well, I didn't do anything crazy with my training. I didn't switch anything. I asked myself what I needed, and it was a much more holistic answer.
Totally. And the so we saw at the Olympic trials, there were a bunch of athletes from Stanford that performed well. And so part of me wants to, like, push on that avenue a little bit, and like ask more about the like, talk to a coach who's been at Stanford for the last 10 years and understand from them, why are your athletes still excelling 20 years later? Why is Sarah Hall, is she truly an outlier, or is there something that she learned at Stanford that enabled her to be a lifelong competitor and athlete? And, she's made, I think, 5 Olympic trials or something like that. And there were 3 or 4 other athletes that came out of that program that did well in this year, in this Olympic trials. And, like, trying to understand what enables longevity in the sport, and what enables longevity at the highest level, which isn't to say it's only useful for professional athletes to understand what that looks like. I think, like, I want to run for another 50 years. And so I want to know what those people are doing, or what the culture is like, and how that works, so that I can communicate that to the thousands of people that listen to my podcast. But the example with Gwen, and the way that you explained it, like, she didn't do anything wild or crazy, right? It's just making a simple tweak.
Yeah, and I think that's often overlooked, right? Like, we always think, like, there's this big complicated silver bullet that we have to find, and that's going to be at the root of all of our issues as an athlete, and help to solve our performance problems, and we'll finally have that breakthrough that we want to have. But, when we go back to what we first talked about at the beginning of this call, I was like, hey, what do you think, like, the common kind of threads are here between these athletes? And you're like, consistency, joy. They understand what the outcomes are that they're working towards, but then they kind of let go a little bit of those outcomes, because they know that the daily actions are what really add up over time to support that. And so, like, you have to know where you're going, but you can't hold so tight to it, because there's a degree of flexibility that you need to have in order to, like, navigate the day-to-day of being a person who's training and pursuing things at a high level. What do you think the role is of community in all of this? What have you seen folks lean into with that, in that respect?
So, with the lens of consistency, or with the thread of consistency being an important aspect, community helps enable consistency. I've had a period of time over the last year or so that it's been really challenging to get out for runs for whatever reason. And if I know that somebody is meeting up with me, or if I know that I'm going to a group run, it's much easier to get out the door. And once I'm running for 10 minutes, I feel fantastic. But the stasis is the enemy, and it's very easy to stay in bed. Or stay in your house. And if you have people or a person that is helping to facilitate consistency, that's worth its weight in gold. And so I know, every Tuesday at whatever time, I know there's someone waiting for me. And every Saturday at 8 a.m. at Tom Watson in Boulder, like that's where things are happening. And so, yeah, the aspect of community, how does community factor in? It's also easier to like run faster when you're with other people. So from like a perception of difficulty standpoint, David and I have talked a lot about my RPE, or rate of perceived exertion, when running with others, and it's like it's remarkably influenced by running with others. I seem to be capable of a lot more when I'm doing it with other people, and like more so than to be expected. But that's a concept that's true in general. So if you're struggling, lean on community. If you can't get out the door, get a buddy that will meet you. That kind of a thing.
Yeah, I can't remember what the exact quote was, and I'm paraphrasing here from something I saw from Adam Grant, was that if you like share a space or an office space, or within like a certain number of feet from another high performer, like you're likely to increase your performance by 20% or something. And I think it's so true. And I think it's really cool to look at all of the different at all levels of running, the power of the group run. And you see this is like prevalent all over the country, people running together and having accountability buddies and folks that you can lean on in the journey, because when someone else is also going through it and trying to figure out how to like make the training work in the context of their life, and is going through the inherent ups and downs too, you can lend a listening ear, you can be supportive, you can get that in return. And there's so much power in kind of sharing in some of the parallel experiences that exist between folks who are pursuing things at a high level. And that doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to try to win an Olympic gold medal. Right. It might just be like trying to run your first 5 or 10K, or complete your first ultra or whatever, but the same rules still apply.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's where it's a vehicle. It's it's a microcosm for things that exist in other places.
What do you think, in your experience, talking to all these folks, what do you think the role of intrinsic motivation, healthy connection to outcome, developing that strong inner world, in it kind of in its essence, developing your own self-efficacy or your own belief in your ability to do hard things? What do you think, like, what level of a role does that play in these athletes that you've interviewed who have been doing this for years, who are continuing to pursue things at a high level and are sustaining that, over multiple seasons?
That's a tough question. I think so. A lot of people lean either intrinsically motivated and what motivates them truly, I mean, going to sound like a broken record, it's curiosity, but also gratitude. And the ability to continue to do this and to continue to persist is what fuels them. Reed Burrows is somebody that comes to mind, that I think you and Reed would have a fantastic conversation. Reed is an ultra trail athlete from Canada. His parents are excellent athletes. He's gifted genetically, but he's also an absolute workhorse. And he said to me, he's like, I put my workouts on Strava because if anybody else tried to copy what I did, they'd break. Um, which is quite a statement. But like, he's running 100 miles a week at high altitude. He lives in Salida at 8,000 feet, and he's doing a lot of training in Leadville. So Reed went through periods of extreme depression. And we talked about this on a run we did in Leadville a few weeks ago. And he told me, he was like, there would be nights that I would be browsing. Anyway, I don't want to share too much. It's his story to tell, but I want to have him on the podcast and like see what he volunteers publicly. I don't know what he said publicly, so I don't want to go there. But let's just say that he's really grateful to be able to be running, and he's lining up at Black Canyon tomorrow. Hopefully, I assume this podcast comes out after tomorrow afternoon. So hopefully, if you're listening to this, you've heard his name because he did well. But for him, the motivation is truly like, I want to be an example for other people who are going through hard things. And so there's a bit of overlap between intrinsic and extrinsic, right? Like, in that there's some of like, I'm doing it for other people, but it's incredibly selfless at the same time. The way I see it is like, if you can demonstrate the ups and the downs and navigating through that, and motivate somebody else to do it also, that's a bit of both, I want to say. And so I do think that there's a good mix of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation that exists and is out there. And I think it's healthy to have both. There are also just there are people who just like love to perform, and they love to put their head down and just grind. And in today's climate with social media and the way that, influencers are rewarded over winning races, sort of tongue in cheek with that a little bit, but it's hard to make it as someone that's like truly just intrinsically motivated. And so even the people that are like fully intrinsically motivated are being pushed to do it for other people in some way, which is tough for a professional athlete. But amateurs don't necessarily have to do it for other people. And so I'd imagine there are a ton of people out there just gritting out, back of the pack 100-mile races, and there's no glory, and they're just like truly in it because they love to suffer and they love to get through hard things, and they've found a way to use running as a vehicle for other aspects of life. So it's not really an answer to your question directly, but like to wrap it up, I guess there do seem to be a lot of people that are intrinsically motivated. However, at the professional stage, you see a lot of like a need to do some things for other people, whether it's how you choose what race you go to, or the shoes you wear, or the story you tell, or whatnot. But I think at the end of the day, everybody needs to understand why they're doing it. And it needs to be more than just because it looks good on Instagram, because that's not enough to get you through hard times. That's enough to like maybe get you out the door for a 3-mile run a couple of times a week, but that's not enough to help you finish a race. That's not enough to help you finish a training block, a serious training block. And the beauty and downside of ultra running and racing and running in general is that it gives you a lot of time to get in your own head and to live in your own head and think about things. And so you'll be forced to figure out what motivates you. And I would challenge anybody who's ever run for longer than 2 hours to tell me that they haven't at some point thought, why am I doing this? And if you didn't come up with a pretty good reason, you could just stop, right? So there has to be a reason for why you're doing it. And the reason has to be more than just like, it's the only way home. Although that could work too.
Yeah, maybe for that one run, but
right.
It would make it difficult for you to want to get out there and run again. And I really appreciated kind of the nuance in your answer. It's just like, well, what I hear is like, oh, there's a mix of both the intrinsic and the extrinsic.
Right.
That's probably kind of where my suspicions were. And, when we think about, okay, like if I'm going to sign up for a race, part of you, if you're ignoring that there's an outcome involved there, I think you're lying to yourself. Like you just wouldn't sign up for races if it was solely an intrinsic endeavor. And although, the percentage of where your motivation lies might be more internal, when you choose a specific goal, you are looking for a specific outcome, you're inevitably connecting to something outside of yourself, even if it has deep meaning. And if you're connecting to, okay, my primary motivation is to hopefully inspire other people to work through the trials and tribulations of their life, to work through the adversity, to make those challenges into building block, whatever your perspective is. Okay, well, why would I be doing that? Likely because it makes you feel a certain way inside. Why do I coach? Well, I like to help people because it also makes me feel good. And so if I don't admit that part of that is selfish and that's inherent in the coaching process, then I'm lying to myself and to my athletes. Like, there's a million, other careers that I could have chosen, and I choose the one that makes me feel as good as possible. That's coaching. And so, anybody out there who's like, oh, I do this, it's completely selfless, check yourself, because if I only get neutral feelings from this, I'd be really surprised if that's the case, because I think you need more than that to sustain the process. And with that in mind, maybe last question before we wrap it up, Jonathan, if there, again, maybe you've answered this already, and if you have, awesome. Let's lean into whatever comes to mind for you. But in sustaining the process long term, what do you think the one or two singular things that athletes could focus on
are? I love this question. I don't want to go as far as to say C's get degrees, but 80% all the time is way better than 100% some of the time. And perfection or a desire for perfection is the enemy of, what is it?
The enemy of good?
Yeah, exactly. If you're doing, it's the 80-20 rule, right? Like if you're doing what you intend to do for the majority of the time, it's way more impactful for the long run. It's way more impactful for the long run than just like a hot flame that burns out.
Yeah, I think those are really great takeaways for folks to think about, and especially so many athletes come into endurance sports and they come in with like high performance in mind from other areas of their life. And they think, what's the answer to that?
Right.
In the running space. Oh, it's to like nail 100% of my workouts at 100% effort, 100% of the time. And I think we should all try to extrapolate the wisdom from folks who have had really successful careers across, all levels of the sport, that like, it's not about being perfect on any one day or every day. It's about being good. The mentality is, I'm good enough today, and my best is always good enough. And it's going to change based on many different factors.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks for being on the podcast,
yeah,
Jonathan. Man. Really appreciated your insights. I could go on and on with this conversation, so we're going to have you back. Guys, For the Long Run podcast, if you have not checked it out, There are so many amazing stories, so many great interviews. It's personal favorite of mine. So thanks again, Jonathan. And folks, if you have any feedback, questions for a future call, topics you'd like us to discuss, visit us on the web, get in touch, microcosm-coaching.com, microcosmcoaching@gmail.com. Thanks,
Awesome.
everybody.
Thanks, TJ.
Thanks, Jonathan.